I was grabbing coffee with an old friend yesterday, a guy who, by all accounts, did everything right. For 15 years, he was the archetype of the perfect husband. Paid the mortgage, funded the vacations, supported every single one of his wife's dreams. He talked about his marriage with this sense of rock-solid certainty. He saw those years of sacrifice as the kind of emotional equity he'd, banked up. He truly believed he had built an unbreakable partnership based on loyalty and shared history. But then the conversation took a dark turn. He told me his company folded 6 months ago, and almost overnight the atmosphere at his house just shifted. He described it not as a slow fade, but as a violent, instantaneous change, like a light switch flipping. The warmth just vanished, replaced by this cold, monotone distance. He told me, and he had this hollow look in his eyes. He said, "I became a ghost in my own house." He was served divorce papers, not because of abuse or infidelity, but because, as her lawyer put it, she needed to secure her future. That sentence I was just staring at him, stunned. It completely shattered the romantic narrative we're all sold.
And it forced me to ask a really brutal question. What if that 15-year history wasn't a bond, but just a business contract? And what if that contract was voided the second he stopped paying the bills? It sounds cynical, I know, but there is a ruthless sociological principle that explains exactly why this happens. And it suggests that for many men, love is entirely conditional on what you can provide right now.
That is, what a devastatingly powerful story, because it just strips away all the cultural layers we put on top of things, and it exposes this core tension at the heart of modern pair bonding.
It really does.
It forces us to confront this reality that for many heterosexual relationships, especially when they're under severe financial stress, love is. It's inextricably linked to security.
And that security is almost always indexed to provision.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to execute a full, multi-layered examination of exactly why that happens. We're going to start by peering into the deepest evolutionary blueprints that govern mate selection. Then we'll analyze relationship dynamics through the pretty unforgiving lens of social exchange theory. And finally, we'll look at the hard economic beta and sociological stress tests that show precisely how quickly and ruthlessly financial shocks can just shatter marital stability.
So we're really unpacking the full phenomenon of why provision seems to be this non-negotiable, continuous condition for long-term commitment.
That's the goal. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's unpack this by starting at the very beginning, our biology. Because if we're going to talk about a contract that's based on provision, we have to look at the ancestral roots of that exchange. And that immediately brings us to Robert Trevers back in 1972 and his foundational concept, Parental Investment Theory, or PIT.
Right. PIT is really the master key to understanding sexual dynamics, not just in humans, but across the entire animal kingdom.
So what's the core idea?
Well, Trevers defined parental investment as any expenditure, so think time, energy, resources, that benefits the offspring. But, and this is the crucial part, it comes at a cost to the parent's ability to invest in other offspring, either current ones or future ones.
So it's a zero-sum game. Investing here means you can't invest there.
Precisely. And the central prediction that comes from this definition is incredibly robust. The sex that invests more in offspring will be significantly more selective when choosing a mate.
Yeah, the choosy ones.
They're the choosy ones. And conversely, the less invested sex will be the one competing, often aggressively, for access to that higher investing sex. It sets up the whole game. Choosiness versus competition.
And in humans, it seems pretty clear that the inherent, just the fixed biological investment difference between the sexes really sets the stage for who gets to be choosy.
Absolutely. The asymmetry is staggering, and you can't really understand human mating without grasping this first. It's driven by the difference in gamete size, availability, and that initial biological commitment.
We kind of forget just how profoundly different the starting point is.
We do. Think about it like this. Women have a finite supply of eggs, maybe 400 potential ova across their entire reproductive lifespan.
400 chances, that's it.
Right. Meanwhile, men produce sperm at a rate of, it's something like 12 million per hour.
The scale is just completely different.
It's a different universe of scale. But more crucially, for a woman, successful fertilization immediately kicks off a minimum 38-week, incredibly resource-intensive commitment of human gestation. And that commitment just continues through birth into lactation and then long-term provisioning for years.
Whereas the male's obligatory minimum investment is
a single effective sperm cell. It just pales in comparison to the years of maternal physical commitment and energy expenditure required.
So this massive initial female investment, it dictates everything that follows. It means selection pressure has to favor a hyperselective female. They have a very limited number of opportunities to reproduce, and every single attempt is astronomically costly to their own survival and their energy reserves.
That's the core of the evolutionary logic. If you are the higher investing sex, the paramount goal, the thing that determines if your genes get passed on, is maximizing the reproductive success of your few, very high-cost offspring.
You can't afford to waste those resources.
You cannot afford to waste them on a mate who is unlikely to stick around or unable to provide the support that's needed. So, over millennia, evolution selected for females who are intensely discriminating about partner quality. And they're looking specifically for traits that signal commitment and, crucially, resource control.
And this need for high investment is compounded in humans because of something you mentioned earlier, altriciality.
Yes. Human altriciality is the critical factor. It's what drives paternal investment up from being, optional to being essentially essential.
And altricial just means helpless, right? Our babies are born completely unable to fend for themselves.
Completely helpless. Our babies are born neurologically and physically underdeveloped. It's actually fascinating if you look at other primates. Their offspring are born with about 45% to 50% of their adult brain mass already developed.
Okay.
Human babies. We're born with only about 25% of our adult brain mass.
Wow. So why are we so unfinished?
It's something called the obstetrical dilemma. Our evolution for walking on 2 feet, for bipedalism, necessitated a narrower birth canal. But this clashed with the fact that, at the same time, our brains were rapidly expanding.
So the baby's head was getting bigger while the ectot was getting smaller.
Exactly. So evolution's compromise was to just push the baby out earlier, before its head got too big to pass through.
So we effectively give birth prematurely compared to what would be optimal, creating this long period of extreme vulnerability where the child is just a massive immobile resource drain.
Precisely. And this created an intense selection pressure, not just for protection, but for prolonged, stable biparental provisioning. If the male just provided the genetic material and then wandered off, the already struggling female would be at a severe disadvantage. Her chances of successfully raising that child to adulthood would plummet.
So the successful male strategy had to shift. It couldn't just be about competing for mating opportunities anymore.
Right. It had to evolve to one that included high parental investment after conception.
So the male's fitness, his own reproductive success, became more and more tied to his capacity to provide predictable, long-term resources. The resources that would ensure his offspring's survival and future success.
Exactly right. Once paternal investment started providing a measurable increase in offspring fitness, which it absolutely does in a highly altricial species like ours, then females who selected for high potential providers.
Instead of just, say, the biggest or most dominant male.
Yes. Those females were reproductively more successful. Their children survived at higher rates. And so those preferences for providing traits got passed down.
Which brings us directly to female preferences in modern mating studies. I mean, how clearly do those preferences map onto this requirement for provision?
Oh, the mapping is explicit. It's one of the most consistently replicated findings in psychology. The studies consistently show a dramatic difference between the criteria used for a short-term fling versus a long-term partner.
What's the difference?
Well, if a woman is seeking a short-term relationship, things like physical attractiveness, immediate excitement, or what you might call good genes cues are often prioritized. But when women consider a long-term partner, especially for marriage, which is the ultimate pair bonding commitment, they place immense emphasis on cues of resource acquisition and the capacity for commitment.
And what are those specific cues they're looking for?
They're looking for indicators of stable provision. Things like career orientation, ambition, financial status, and devotion.
So a man might be attractive, but if he doesn't have a plan.
If he lacks ambition or a career path, he is very unlikely to be selected for a high-cost, long-term relationship. Because that lack of ambition signals a potential failure to provide security during those incredibly vulnerable child-rearing years. The deeper the resource commitment required by the offspring, the more heavily women weigh these provisioning traits.
The theory then gets extrapolated even further into the very structure of human relationships, specifically around the concept of concealed ovulation.
Yes, that's one of the most intriguing evolutionary psychological theories about pair bonding. The idea suggests that concealed ovulation, the lack of any explicit external signal telling a male exactly when a woman is fertile, evolved, in part, to coerce men into staying.
How would that work?
Well, think about it. If a man knows precisely when a woman is fertile, his most reproductively successful strategy might be to mate with her during that window and then...
Go look for other opportunity.
Exactly. Mate with other women in between her fertile periods.
But if he doesn't know when she's fertile,
Then the optimal strategy for maximizing his own genetic investment is to remain in continuous protective proximity, to engage in repeated mating throughout her cycle.
to stick around.
To stick around. And this continuous presence, this constant vigilance, translates directly into increased paternal investment protection, resource sharing, provisioning, all of which maximizes the survival chances of his potential offspring. The concealed signal essentially mandates a long-term continuous commitment mechanism where the male can't easily game the system.
So, the relationship structure that my friend thought was based on loyalty and shared history, it might actually have its deepest roots in a biological mechanism designed to lock in his resources for the long haul. And the moment he loses those resources, he loses his evolutionary purpose within that bond.
That's the brutal logic of it, yes. The evolutionary contract is always at its core implicitly conditional on the continuous delivery of the required resource, which is provision, because that is what drives the fitness benefit of the pair bond in the first place. Now, if the evolutionary blueprint is the why we seek provision, then social exchange theory, or SET, perfectly describes the how this transaction operates in our daily conscious lives.
Right. This is where we move from ancient biology to what feels like modern cynicism, which unfortunately seems incredibly accurate when we look at the hard end of relationships.
SET analyzes all human interactions, including romantic ones, through a purely economic transactional lens.
A cost-benefit analysis.
Exactly. It posits that interactions continue only if both parties perceive a positive profit. You have to feel like you're receiving more than you're giving up, or at least breaking even. In a relationship, rewards are resources that bring pleasure, satisfaction, security. Costs are resources perceived as losses or punishments. Emotional stress, wasted time, financial strain.
And the transaction includes everything: time, emotional labor, social status, and crucially for this discussion, sexual access and financial stability.
It does. The core SET concept, when you apply it to heterosexual relationships, is that sexual intimacy is a highly valuable resource or commodity. It's something a woman often gives to a man, not gratuitously, but in exchange for other valuable commodities.
Like commitment, respect, social status, or items of monetary value, provision.
Exactly. And if you look at it as a market, the dynamics become very predictable. The suppliers, in this model women, seek to keep the price of the commodity high, and the consumers, men, seek to lower that price.
But isn't calling sex a commodity a bit reductive? I mean, how does SET account for genuine emotional connection or physical attraction? Those aren't really resources in a traditional sense.
That's a vital distinction to make. SET doesn't deny the existence of attraction or genuine emotion, but it argues that those factors are inputs into the reward calculation. They're not outside of the exchange.
So they're part of the benefits column on the ledger.
Precisely. Attraction is a powerful reward. But the act of providing sexual intimacy, which historically has carried greater reproductive risk and social costs for women, is often behaviorally conditional. The emotional reward is maximized when the partner has fulfilled the requirements of the transaction, which are commitment and provision. SET is powerful because it explains behavioral outcomes and power dynamics, regardless of the underlying emotional landscape.
And that power dynamic is defined by who holds the key to the exchange. This is the gatekeeper role.
Absolutely. The evidence on this is overwhelming. It suggests that women, not men, have the most influence over when a relationship progresses sexually. Women are the definitive gatekeepers of sexuality within the pair bond.
How do we know that?
Well, empirically, a woman's expectations about when a relationship should become sexual are much, much better predictors of when sex actually occurs than the man's expectations are. This control mechanism is what reinforces the valuation disparity.
And this gatekeeping role helps explain why we see certain social behaviors, like the sexual double standard, aimed at keeping the market value of female sexuality high across the board.
Precisely. If sexuality is a valuable commodity in this exchange market, then any excessive supply or devaluation threatens the exchange rate for everyone. This is why studies often show that women judge sexually promiscuous women more harshly than men do.
It's a form of social enforcement.
It's social enforcement that supports the underlying economic goal of maintaining scarcity. By socially punishing a high supply, the perceived value of the commodity remains high, which maximizes the return in commitment and resources for the women who adhere to that gatekeeping structure.
This valuation disparity also extends to concepts like virginity, which really highlights just how much more social currency female sexuality holds than male sexuality in this transactional framework.
Oh, the disparity is massive, and it's very revealing. When studies ask people how they perceive virginity, women are twice as likely to view their virginity as a gift to a significant other.
The language itself implies a transaction, a high-value item being exchanged.
It implies an exchange for something equally valuable, like long-term commitment and love. Conversely, men are 3 times as likely to view their virginity as a stigma that needs to be discarded.
So a man's sexuality isn't seen as a valuable asset he controls in the same way.
No. Its perceived value is often tied to his status or his success in the outside world, not the simple physical act itself.
It provides a really functional, though maybe uncomfortable lens for viewing a lot of traditional cultural customs.
All of those customs men paying for gifts for dinner, the expectation of a high-value engagement ring, they align perfectly with this exchange dynamic. They are either compensations for the commodity provided, or they are demonstrations of the capacity to provide the resources necessary to close that long-term deal.
And we see this with status, too.
We do. There's evidence that women can gain access to higher social status men by offering sex as a reward for that status. But the reverse exchange, a high-status woman getting access to a higher status man purely through the offer of sex, is far less common, if it happens at all. The female resource is the sexual access. The male resource is the provision and status.
Okay, let's connect this market dynamic back to the tragedy of my friend. He felt his 15 years of sacrifice had built up emotional equity. The investment model is a specific theory that describes what he thought he was banking on.
Yes. The investment model is the long-term extension of Cessation, and it's crucial for understanding commitment. It makes a key distinction between satisfaction derived from the relationship and commitment to it. Investments are defined as resources given to the relationship, things like time spent, shared memories, a house you own together, mutual friends, that cannot be retrieved if the relationship ends.
They're sunk costs.
They are non-retrievable, sunk costs. And these investments are supposed to increase commitment independent of your current level of satisfaction.
So he saw his 15 years of income and their shared life as these massive, non-retrievable investments that should have stabilized the relationship. He had huge sunk costs.
Precisely. He was counting on the sheer size of those sunk costs, that emotional equity, to anchor the partnership when the short-term rewards, in this case his income, temporarily stopped. But the immediate violent dissolution of the marriage suggests a painful recategorization occurred for his partner.
What do you mean?
For her, it seems the financial provision wasn't categorized as an illiquid, non-retrievable investment that built commitment over time. It was perceived as a continuous, perishable reward that was necessary for the relationship's solvency.
Like a subscription fee.
It's a brutal analogy, but it fits. Once that continuous reward stopped flowing, the investment model was overridden. The relationship wasn't built on commitment derived from sunk costs, but rather on a commitment that was conditioned on perpetual economic security.
And when the solvency was threatened.
The underlying transactional nature of the pair bond was suddenly revealed. If the primary reward offered by one partner's security and provision vanishes, the other partner, particularly if they are deeply dependent on that reward, must logically move to void the contract and secure those benefits somewhere else. So we've established the evolutionary drive and the social framework, but now we need the empirical proof. We need the data. To really confirm the conditionality of provision, we have to look at what happens when a relationship gets hit by a massive external financial shock, something unforeseen that we can measure in a population.
The general correlation is pretty common knowledge, right? Poverty and financial strain correlate strongly with higher rates of relationship breakdown. But that doesn't really tell us which mechanism is at work.
Exactly. A lack of economic resources can induce this destructive chain reaction that sociologists call the family stress model, or FSM.
Okay, what's that?
FSM basically posits that an income loss leads to tangible economic stress, like not being able to pay bills. That stress then translates into psychological distress. It increases financial conflicts between partners, which lowers satisfaction and ultimately can lead to divorce.
But that's just one hypothesis. We need high-quality data to test it against the alternatives.
We do, and that's where this quasi-experimental study from Switzerland comes in. It analyzed a reduction in unemployment insurance duration, and it acts as a perfect controlled financial stress test.
Right, this is a fantastic piece of research. It's so powerful because it's not just a correlation, it's almost like a natural experiment.
It's what we call a quasi-experiment, exactly. In 2011, Switzerland implemented a policy reform that kind of arbitrarily reduced the maximum duration of unemployment insurance benefits for certain people from 1.5 years down to just 1 year.
So it created a clear treatment group who experienced this sudden mandatory reduction in their financial security and a control group who didn't.
A perfect control group. So you can isolate the effect of that one variable, the reduction in unemployment benefits, and see what happens to, in this case, divorce rates.
And the results were stark.
They were. The reform caused a measurable 2.8 percentage point increase in divorce among those it affected.
Which might not sound like a huge number, but in population terms, that's a 25% overall increase. That's massive.
It's a huge relative increase for a policy change that was only supposed to affect the unemployed individual, not their entire family structure.
And the timescale is important here, too.
The timescale is crucial. This effect had a substantial lag. It only became statistically significant 4 years after the initial unemployment spell began.
So these aren't quick, rash decisions.
Not at all. We are measuring the accumulated toxic effect of prolonged financial stress and conflict finally leading to the relationship's collapse. The reform effectively cut long-term benefits by about 23% for those long-term unemployed, which just accelerated the financial stress on the whole family unit.
Okay, so before we look at the internal dynamics, we have to address the alternative hypothesis. How did this study prove that the family stress model was the dominant mechanism and not the cost independence hypothesis?
This is where the depth of the analysis really matters. The cost independence hypothesis argues that divorce is an expensive process. You've got legal fees, the loss of economies of scale when you split one household into two.
So it's cheaper to stay together.
That's the cost side of it. It suggested that a negative income shock should actually depress divorce rates because couples simply couldn't afford to separate.
So if that hypothesis held, we should have seen the poorest couples sticking together out of financial necessity.
Exactly. They would be forced to endure the relationship, however unhappy, because they couldn't afford to live apart.
But that's not what the data showed.
The Swiss data directly refuted this. If divorce was unaffordable, the impact should have been minimal or even negative among the poorest couples. Instead, the increase in divorce was heavily concentrated among the most financially vulnerable. The bottom income tercile saw a staggering 5.8 percentage point increase in divorce rates.
That's a 56% higher rate than expected.
Yes. And the upper income households who could easily absorb that UI benefit reduction, they were completely unaffected.
That's decisive.
It decisively demonstrates that the financial stress caused by the loss of security dramatically outweighs the financial cost of separation, at least when couples are already struggling.
That's the sound of the financial security contract snapping. But the traditional family stress model often includes a gendered component. It suggests stress is higher when the male breadwinner norm is violated. Did the data confirm that? Was it all about the violation of traditional male roles?
This is one of the most interesting and nuanced findings of the study, and it really validates a more universal understanding of the provision contract. While a lot of earlier studies did focus on gender, the Swiss data found that the stress was entirely attributable to the spouse's relative contribution to household income, not their biological sex.
So it didn't matter if you were a man or a woman, it mattered if you were the primary earner.
Precisely. The increase in divorce was only observed among primary earners, those contributing more than 50% of the household income. It validated a gender-neutral version of the family stress model.
Okay, so tell us about the breakdown between male and female primary earners. This is the part that really surprised me.
The findings were profound. For unemployed male breadwinners, the divorce rate increased by 40% compared to the counterfactual, a very significant jump. But the most pronounced effect was observed for unemployed female breadwinners. Their divorce rate increased by a massive 78%.
78%, wow. Why is the effect so much stronger when the female partner is the primary earner and she loses her job?
There are a few likely explanations, and they all tie back to this concept of financial dependency and contract violation. First, while we are moving toward egalitarianism, in the segment of the population where income is low, which is where this effect was concentrated, traditional roles are sometimes even more rigidly held. So when the female breadwinner loses her job, it can trigger a double shock. The financial loss, plus the violation of an implicit agreement where the male partner may not have expected to have to step up as the replacement primary earner.
And secondly,
If a female is the primary earner in a low-income household, the entire family may be deeply dependent on her specific income for survival. So its loss is just more financially catastrophic than the loss of an equivalent income by a man in a household with more of a buffer.
so the conclusion is crystal clear. The stress that leads to divorce is greatest when the income loss is financially significant for the couple, and it breaks the structure of financial dependency, regardless of whether the primary earner is male or female.
The data proves it. The contract is conditional on solvency, full stop. The system is ruthlessly effective at dissolving partnerships where the provision mechanism fails, regardless of who is holding that provisioning role.
We've seen the hard data of divorce, but that economic shock only explains the behavior. The story I started with was about the feeling, the cold switch flip, becoming a ghost in your own house. That takes us into the psychological realm, specifically into the expectations and anxieties that make a man's financial insecurity so devastating. And this is tied to a concept called benevolent sexism.
Yes, benevolent sexism, or BS, is the concept that often traps both partners in these rigid conditional roles. It's defined as a set of subjectively positive beliefs that women should be cherished, protected, and provided for by men. It's often romanticized as chivalry.
Sounds nice on the surface.
It does. In exchange for this protection and provision, women are generally expected to retain power in the domestic sphere while deferring to men in the public sphere. It paints this very attractive, complementary picture.
But it operates as a rigid, prescriptive contract.
It is the ultimate conditional contract. For women who endorse BS, the financial provision from the man is the critical promised benefit. It's what makes accepting gender inequalities in the workplace or leadership palatable, because in return, they receive financial security.
So if that financial provision fails,
The entire romanticized structure collapses, and that leads to acute psychological fallout.
there was a recent study that tracked mixed-gender couples during the severe financial uncertainty of the pandemic, which provided a perfect real-time look at how BS influences the reaction to reduced financial security. What did they observe regarding the man's anxiety?
That study was excellent because it used weekly tracking, so the researchers could see these immediate volatile shifts in mood and relationship satisfaction that correlated with changing financial conditions. They focused on men's anxiety because anxiety reflects a state of personal distress and perceived threat. And they found, not surprisingly, that men's anxiety was strongly and negatively associated with their financial security.
The less secure they felt, the more anxious they became.
Right. But the key finding wasn't just that men get anxious when they're poor. It was that this anxiety was amplified or minimized based on the partner's expectations.
The woman's expectation.
The woman's expectations. The link between his financial security and his anxiety was powerfully moderated by the woman's level of benevolent sexism. When women were higher in benevolent sexism, the man felt significantly more anxious when he was less financially secure. And conversely, if he was secure, he felt less anxious.
So the men are highly attuned to their partner's expectation level. They're almost unconsciously calibrating their own well-being based on how well they think they're meeting that BS contract.
That's a perfect way to put it. The loss of income isn't just an inconvenience for him, it's an internal breach of his self-definition. He's experiencing shame, personal failure, because he knows, deep down, he is failing to fulfill the protective role his partner expects of him.
The psychological cost is tied directly to the violation of that prescriptive role. I am a provider and protector. When he fails to provide, he feels he has personally failed as a man in that relationship.
Exactly. The anxiety is the internal signal of this breach. This explains that hollow look in your friend's eyes. He didn't just lose his job, he lost his sense of self-worth and purpose within that specific partnership structure.
So how did the partner, the woman, experience this same breach of contract? It wasn't anxiety for her, was it?
No, the consequences for the woman played out as a relationship failure, not a personal failure. Her relationship satisfaction was linked to her partner's financial security, and again, it was strongly moderated by her own benevolent sexism. Women who were higher in benevolent sexism reported significantly lower relationship satisfaction when their partner reported lower financial security.
So the man is anxious because he feels he failed. The woman is dissatisfied because the relationship failed to deliver the promised security. It's two different forms of failure driven by the same economic shock.
It's two sides of the same transactional coin. The woman who endorses BS views the man's financial failure not as a problem they need to solve together, but as a violation of the explicit agreement she accepted. It's a failure of the relationship mechanism itself to provide the security she felt entitled to. This mindset perfectly bridges to that lawyer's brutal phrase, she needed to secure her future.
The partner didn't feel obligated to fix the man. She felt entitled to leave the failing relationship to find a solvent one.
That's the cold logic it imposes.
It paints a picture where these romantic ideas of benevolent sexism are actually the poison that makes the contract so conditional and so fragile. But the study also showed a way out of this trap, didn't it?
It did. It provided a genuinely hopeful contrast. For women who were lower in benevolent sexism, their relationship satisfaction remained remarkably stable and high, even when the man reported lower financial security.
They were psychologically buffered against the shock.
They were, and this is the protective effect of low BS.
Because they weren't hypervigilant, looking for a contract violation, they could view the financial stress as just an external challenge to be dealt with.
Precisely. They're less likely to operate under that strict complementary gender role ideology, which frees them from seeing the income loss as a personal or a relational failure. They treat the financial problem as something to be tackled jointly, which facilitates cooperation rather than triggering the acute anxiety and dissatisfaction that leads to collapse.
So the data confirms that while that evolutionary drive for provision is deep, the way we structure our modern psychological expectations through frameworks like benevolent sexism can either amplify that conditionality into acute fragility, or it can allow the relationship to withstand the shock.
That's right. And when you think about the Swiss data, where the financial shocks hit hardest at the bottom of the income scale,
those couples are often operating under maximum stress.
Maximum stress. And if they also adhere to traditional high benevolent sexism views, the shock violates the contract on both a purely financial level and a profound psychological level. It makes that immediate dissolution we saw in the opening story almost inevitable.
So we started with the story of a man who thought 15 years of sacrifice had banked him emotional equity, only to find the relationship dissolved the second his income vanished. This deep dive has shown that his tragedy is really rooted in three intertwined, ruthless mechanisms. We began with the evolutionary mandate. The enormous cost of maternal investment necessitated demanding high paternal resources in a long-term mate. That established provision as a fundamental condition of the bond.
Then we analyzed the social transaction through social exchange theory. It views marriage as a contract where sexual intimacy and domesticity are exchanged for commitment and financial security, a contract that is behaviorally voided the minute that continuous reward flow ceases.
And finally, the sociological stress tests reveal the failure mechanism in real time.
Yes. Financial insecurity, especially when it's amplified by the psychological expectations embedded in benevolent sexism, triggers this acute anxiety in men, a sense of personal failure for violating the provider role. And at the same time, it causes measurable relationship dissatisfaction in the partner, which manifests as a rational move to secure future provision elsewhere.
The ultimate synthesis seems to be that financial provision acts not merely as a beneficial resource, but as the crucial continuous validation of the man's long-term mating value and commitment.
He has to continuously demonstrate solvency to validate his role as a protector and provider, fulfilling the promise that's inherent in the pair bond. The data shows this principle is applied ruthlessly. It strikes hardest at the lowest income couples whose security structures just shatter when that financial pillar is removed, and it does so irrespective of the primary earner's gender.
The structure of human pair bonding means the relationship contract is never truly secure. It requires continuous solvency against the deepest evolutionary instincts and persistent societal expectations.